But in terms of the long-term perspective, the big picture here, Julian's persecution tells, yes, the story of the persecution of a man, of a kind of small journalistic, courageous project, but also a bigger story about freedom of information in the age of the internet and how that trajectory has gone, which has gone into a increasing repression, increasing censorship, and in Julian's case, the abuse of the legal system in order to silence a journalist, to put him in prison, and to ultimately silence Wikileaks and send a message to the rest of the press and whistleblowers that this is what will happen.
Il caso Julian Assange continua da più di un decennio ormai ed è dal mio punto di vista il caso legale non solo più importante per quanto riguarda la libertà del giornalismo oggi e in particolare per il futuro. Per me è anche una storia personale a cui sono molto legato perché ha veramente accompagnato tutta la mia vita da adulto e questo ci aiuterà anche un po' a dare un po' di contesto a quello che sta succedendo. Quello che sta avvenendo a Julian Assange è assolutamente spettrale, è incredibile che stia succedendo nel mondo libero e che continui con una, diciamo, violenza anche politica che non sembra accennarsi. Non sentirete ovviamente tutto questo da me, ma da una ospite molto importante, la moglie di Julian Assange, che sta portando avanti una battaglia tenace e fondamentale per la libertà di Julian Assange, ma anche del giornalismo e potenzialmente di tutti noi. So it's my real great pleasure to introduce you Stella Assange here at OneX Fest today.
Thank you.
Well, that's quite a nice welcoming, I guess.
Thank you.
Grazie. Stella, it's so great to have you with us today. And before I was just saying a few words in Italian, I was going back to how Wired, but all of us, has been connected with Julian for a while. And I remember having an interview with him in 2014, and he was not free because he was forced to stay in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Then he was our guest here in 2016, and he was not free. Then in 2018, Chelsea Manning was here, and Julian was not free. Fast forward to 2 years ago, you were here, and Julian was in prison. And now we are here, you are here, and Julian is still in prison. And this is a story that goes on for more than a decade now. So how do you see that in perspective somehow? It's such a long story, and it doesn't look like it's coming to an end somehow.
Well, you're right. Excuse me. It's been really since 2010, and he lost his liberty on the 7th of December 2010, and that was exactly a week after Wikileaks started publishing Cablegate. He was initially in prison for 10 days, then under house arrest, then in the embassy for almost 7 years. And now he's been in a high security prison for over 5 years. And as time goes by, I mean, the embassy seemed like an eternity, but the time that he's spent inside this high security prison, Belmarsh in London, is almost as long as he's been in the embassy. He was in the embassy. And well, I think, look, the fight to free Julian is a difficult one, but I think politically we've gained a lot of support. I mean, Italy has been incredible. I see a lot of people in the audience here. The activists here have been extraordinary. I mean, I think they're an example for the rest of Europe to follow, actually. There are groups in many countries that are doing a lot, but I think the Italian activists are absolutely amazing. And a lot of the political support we've seen has come from the grassroots. In Australia, we've seen this translate into political action. So the Australian government, for example, up until this current administration, was basically facilitating Julian's persecution. But it was through the grassroots movement that this turned around, and the current Prime Minister, Albanese, when he was running to become Prime Minister for the Labour government, his platform was to find a solution to bring Julian home. And then he was elected, and once he was elected, he's kept on with that message. So that's come because it was politically feasible for him to do so and to do the right thing, to start saying the right thing. And that only comes from this bottom up. So, I mean, legally, the situation has narrowed, although recently we've had a win.
Yeah.
In about a month ago, I think, or 2 months now, I lose track of time, but the High Court said that Julian could appeal, and there will be a hearing on the 9th and 10th of July, and finally he'll be able to bring his arguments to the High Court. But in terms of the long-term perspective, the big picture here, Julian's persecution tells, yes, the story of the persecution of a man, of a kind of small journalistic, courageous project, but also a bigger story about freedom of information in the age of the internet, and how that trajectory has gone, which has gone into a increasing repression, increasing censorship, and in Julian's case, the abuse of the legal system in order to silence a journalist, to put him in prison, and to ultimately silence Wikileaks and send a message to the rest of the press and whistleblowers that this is what will happen.
And you mentioned the hearing that is happening in almost a month from now, so in early July. And I mean, I've been following the case as a journalist, so I'm kind of into things, but from outside, kind of the legal interconnection of all of this with the UK, with the US, it's astonishing, like the level of complexity that's reached. So I would like to explain us where we are now and why this hearing in July is so important, finally.
Well, the case against Julian and Wikileaks is an outrage from the beginning. The legal case against him, of course, is just one aspect of the many attacks there have been on him. But the legal case criminalizes news gathering and publishing outright. He is charged under the Espionage Act, but that's just the label of this piece of legislation. There's no, how we commonly understand espionage is you're working on behalf of a foreign power or something. That's not what the US is alleging at all. The US is saying that Wikileaks got this information from Chelsea Manning, who was an insider in the US military, and that Wikileaks possessed it and communicated it to the public, not on behalf of a foreign power, but for the benefit of informing the public. And here the
definition of journalism.
Yeah, the definition of journalism. And if you exchange the enemy foreign power for the public, then you're redefining journalism as espionage. And so this is the US case. And of course, in fact, it's an old trick. Like, you can't criminalize journalism by calling it, the Journalism Censorship Act. You repurpose the Espionage Act in order to criminalize the activity. And the activity that is criminalized is news gathering, receiving, possessing, and publishing, communicating information to the public. And of course, all the main press freedom organizations understand this. That's why you have the CPJ and RSF and IFJ and so on saying this case is the most dangerous attack on press freedom globally, because it is redefining news gathering it is redefining news gathering and journalism as criminal activity and criminal conspiracy.
And it's also setting a precedent that it may be applied to others in the future. So one of the concerns that press freedom organizations, but also news organizations are raising is that now it's on Assange, but if this goes in the direction the US authorities would like it to go, then it can be applied to others. So that's why we were saying this is about Julian Assange, it's about Wikileaks, but it's also about journalism in general. So that's one of the points for how this battle is so is so important at the moment.
Yeah, it sets the legal theory that the U.S. government has set in motion. It was set in motion under the Trump administration. The indictment against Julian came in December 2017 under seal. Yep. And that was during the Trump administration, obviously, and the Biden administration has just run with it, and it's so pernicious because unless the Biden administration decides to drop it, or a future administration, but basically the theory stands. The U.S., the only way they can remotely undo some of the damage that has been done is to drop it, which should be the expectation that is set by everyone, every news organization that's concerned about this case, and that's what Amnesty and CPJ and so on are demanding. But it's not just a legal precedent, and we're not just talking about the United States. If the United States sets this legal precedent, which it's trying to do or is advancing, then what's to stop any other state from using the same theory to pursue dissidents and journalists who are in exile, or even foreign journalists and dissident or critics or whatever? All you need is an allied government that doesn't want one person's destiny to get in the way of their foreign relations, and of course that's the case for this is big politics, and rarely do they put an individual's rights and freedoms before the interests of an ally. So of course the legal precedent, but then there's the political precedent, and basically it makes journalists and publishers, dissidents, critics fair game for the United States, but also everywhere else. It just lowers the standards globally.
You mentioned the Biden administration and the Trump administration were also the opponents in the forthcoming election. Do you have any view on that, on how the elections may have an impact also on Julian's case?
Well, look, it's all politics, and I'd be foolish to suggest that one's much worse than the other, because both of them have kept Julian in prison. That being said, we have noticed that the Biden administration is less aggressive about this indictment, about this extradition than the Trump administration was. We have examples like there was a leak in the Wall Street Journal, I believe, saying that when the UK Home Secretary signed off the extradition order, approved, greenlit it, at the time it was Priti Patel, and she asked the DOJ to kind of publicly thank her, and they didn't. So that's
nice
one,
of them.
Yeah. But then 1 week later, Mike Pompeo went and visited her, and they did a photo op, even though he didn't have any role in the Biden administration, obviously. So anyway, so the DOJ under Biden has had this approach, this was initiated under the Trump administration. We're just, doing something like that. That's their policy to continue it. But we know that within this administration, there are a lot of internally, there are views that this case should end, that this is a very pernicious case, that it is obviously going to be instrumentalized by future administration, be it in the next administration or any future administration, right? And so there is an internal view by some sections of the Biden administration that this should end. Of course, there's also the other sections, right? Because we know during the Trump administration that Mike Pompeo had asked for plans and options about how to kidnap or even assassinate Julian. It would be naive to think that those sections don't exist throughout different administrations. Of course, there are people, there are interests within the US intelligence, national security sector, the more extreme elements who want Julian imprisoned for life. But the point is that there are different factions, and these factions exist in the Biden administration, they existed during the Trump administration, and that the political environment is what determines whether Julian is free, which faction wins, essentially.
When we were talking about the different stages of the case, we mentioned that Julian has been arrested in 2019 and he's in a prison in the UK now. And I don't know if the public has a real understanding of what that means for his life, for your life. So what is the condition where Julian Assange is today? And if you follow the news, there are constant notes about his health, physically and mentally. So can you describe his reality at the moment?
Well, his physical reality is of complete deprivation. He's in a small cell, that's 6 square meters large. This is his reality, basically, this space here. And he spends 22 hours a day on average inside this cell. He has no access to the internet. He has limited access to the phone. He can call me and a few other people that the prison has pre-approved. All our conversations are recorded. There's an initial message when he calls me, because I can't call him. When he calls, there's about 20 seconds saying, the prisoner is trying to call you. This is to let you know that this conversation is being recorded. And don't hang up, now we will connect you. So every conversation, of course, is recorded. And he can only call during certain times of day. He can only call for 10 minutes at a time, and then it just cuts off, and then you have to wait before he can call back. He eats in his cell alone, not out of choice, but because that's the way it's done in Belmarsh prison. He can exit the cell for 5 minutes to go and collect medication from a little hatch that's at the end of the corridor, and then go back to the cell they lock him back in the cell. He can go into the yard, which is a kind of cement yard with mesh on top and barbed wire on the sides. And that's where most of his interactions with other people takes place, which is obviously other prisoners, and this is a high security prison, so you can imagine the type of people he's interacting with. This is Julian, he is a thinker, an intellectual, a public commentator who is being cut off from the world in every way, and forced into these conditions for what, He's being treated literally like the worst criminals in the UK. He's been put in the same place. For what? He's not convicted of any crime. He's not serving a sentence, and yet he's been there for more than 5 years, and he's been there for longer than many people who have been convicted for horrible crimes. In the UK, you only serve 50% of a custodial sentence. So the people who have been there as long as him have been convicted to 11, 12 years. And it's a very harsh environment. One of the people who he had a friendship with in his wing committed suicide during the COVID period, which was even more isolation. And he has, endured not only the immediate deprivations of being there, but as I said, close friends like John Pilger, who have died in the meantime, Vivienne Westwood, etc. And he mourns the passing of his close friends alone in isolation every day. Every day is extremely difficult. And of course, in addition to all this, the physical deterioration that I see, you know, it's terrible and inhumane and absolutely, like, this is political repression. This is a reality of political repression in the West.
Yeah, and it's astonishing to listen to your answer and thinking about that this is happening in a European capital for journalists, which is kind of, I think, the kind of zeitgeist we ended up living in. We have still a couple of minutes, and I would like to ask you, although that's probably a difficult question, how do you see the future? What are the outcomes that you and your family are taking into account for the next future?
I have to be optimistic, and in spite of the day-to-day difficulty, I look at things in terms of trajectories. And of course this is political and things can take a terrible turn at any moment. But in terms of the political trajectory, I believe that Julian will be freed. And how he will be freed is just a matter of speculation. The fact is, you know, if Albanese and Biden and whoever else who's, you know, involved in this get together and say, okay, let's just get rid of this, then Julian will be freed. And to me, it really doesn't matter how he's freed. If he's freed, we win. And that doesn't mean that it cancels out all the harm that's been done to Julian and our family and so on. But the important thing is that he's freed. For journalism, more generally, the only good outcome is for the Biden administration to drop this case, to drop it, to pardon Julian, whatever, because the harm stays for journalism if this legal precedent is not undone.
Stella, our time is up, but I would like to thank you very much for being with us to share your story and for fighting what is the good battle. And thank you, all of us, for being so numerous. Stella, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right.